So moving on to saturation now then. I've added the saturator effect to the device chain for the first kick we were looking at. And we're going to look at a few different techniques for working with this, which range from just using it as an insert and getting to know the various controls here and how they can be used to most effectively process bass frequencies. And then also looking at more complex ways of using it in parallel to really target the areas of the spectrum that we want to be focusing in on. So first up then, you can hear with it on the track now, if I turn up the drive, it doesn't take very long for it to become a lot beefier and start to transform quite a lot. Now, if you don't mind those additions in the upper part of the frequency spectrum and the kind of overall change to the timbre and vibe of the kick, then you might get some good results that way. And you could just tailor it using the dry wet, say. And get a kind of beefier sound whilst not transforming it too much and only adding a few of those extra upper frequencies. But one thing you might like to do instead is to incorporate these filters at the bottom. I say filters, there's two filters here, but actually I only tend to use the first one here controlled by the bass dial. Now these are on as default when you load the plugin, but if you don't see these controls, if they're inactive, then make sure you activate the color switch. And then this bass control is a bit like a tone control you might see on other effects, where it leans the effect more towards the lower frequencies or the upper frequencies. You can certainly hear as I increase it, going back to fully wet. Let's bring this up a bit. I'll bring it up quite a bit and actually bring the output down. You can clearly hear there it's pushed it all the way up the spectrum. And in fact, if I just bring the EQ here so we can see that, it's completely flattened the spectrum there and we've lost all of the bass. But going the other way, when we get around there, it's really kind of zoning in more on the sub-frequencies and we've lost all of that extra kind of crunch and all those harmonics that were being added. So it's a really good control to know, particularly when you're processing bass sounds, if you want to, leave the upper part of the spectrum alone and just beef up the bass. So you might get some good results there from playing around with the different controls and also trying out some different modes. I wouldn't recommend going for the Sinoid Fold, Digital Clip or Wave Shaper because they're a little bit too extreme and they tend to mangle the sound quite a lot. So I wouldn't really use them on kicks. These ones here, Analog Clip is actually the kind of softest or gentlest of these four and they get progressively harder. You can experiment with the different modes and then the amount of drive that you apply and then tweak the bass slightly and the dry wet to get different effects there. So you might find you get quite a lot of success with that. And we could also add in the EQ bands afterwards, of course, to get a little bit more control of those areas. So together they might create quite a nice little effects chain. And of course we can group them together by clicking on one, holding down Shift and clicking on the other one. and then Command G or right click and group to put them in a rack together. And yeah, quite a nice, relatively gentle rack there, kind of fattening up the kick. So that's the first way we're going to look at there. Minimizing these though, if I add saturator once again, we're going to look at another way now, and that's using it in parallel. So what we're going to do now is group this up straight away by hitting Command G, and then activate, or rather display, our chain list, right click and create an extra chain. So if you're totally new to racks, then what this does is it allows us to have, rather than just one chain running along our, or one signal path running along our device chain here, we split off and have a second one. So we have two chains running in parallel. This one has no effects on through this rack, so it's our dry chain. And then this one has our saturator set to 100%, much like a send effect. So if you're not working in Ableton Live and you want to achieve this kind of effect and you don't have racks or anything like that, then you can use a return channel or an auxiliary channel in exactly the same way. You just put the effect on there and route your sound to it. But with racks, you don't have to do that. So now what we can do is use this as our saturation chain, which we can add EQ8 to, just dropping it straight after there. And now setting it up in the same way as before by having bands 1 and 2 with our extreme filters there, but 2 we're going to set to, let's try sort of 70 even, so it should really focus in on the sub frequencies. So now we've just isolated the sub frequencies there. We can saturate them. As much as we like to really fatten them up there without affecting any of the other frequencies in the kick. So if I bring this in and out now, and obviously that's way too much, but if you use the chain level here, you can dial that up and down. And rather than do that, I'm going to actually right click it and map it to macro 1. So I've got a macro here. It's not going to make too much difference. I wouldn't have thought what curve or what mode you set there, because they tend to have more of an effect on the upper frequencies. And as we're really just zoning in on the sub there, we're probably not going to hear much of a difference. But yeah, you can hear how effective that is. If I just hit minus to get rid of some of our macros. Yeah, you can hear how effective that is at just really maximizing that bass, much like a max bass effect or some other similar one that allows you to beef up the sub frequencies. Now, if you wanted to get totally ridiculous with it, then you could come into the chain list here, and I'm actually going to rename these by, if I right click, I can choose rename or Command R as the shortcut. So we'll name that one sat for saturation and then dry. What you could do is duplicate this chain. Again, right click and choose duplicate or Command D. So now you have two chains with saturation. Which gives you a kind of ridiculous amount of sub control there. You can always deactivate it later, but it might be a handy thing to have in the rack. And I could carry on and duplicate again. But for this next one, just set it to a higher part of the spectrum. So, you know, I could go for the upper part of the range if you wanted to. For this one, I'll map it to macro 2. So we have a separate control there from our sub. And you can go for other areas of the spectrum as well. As we saw in the first lesson, you might not want to pick these frequencies up in particular, or let's duplicate it again. And for this one, map it to macro 3, add that one back in. And then for this one, we'll go even higher, like up to 500. And let's just solo that one. Oh, now it's down here. Whether or not that's something I really want in this kick, I'm not sure, but in certain situations, you might find this kind of processing really useful because you can focus in on these parts of the spectrum and kind of fatten them up and, you know, beef them up and add interesting bits of color and interesting textures and layers to the kick or other sounds. So this kind of rack, much like any multi-band exciter, can be a really useful rack to have in your collection. So as if by magic, I've gone ahead and created that rack by literally just adding extra chains, as we can see here, which control different areas of the spectrum. So we got our 2 subs initially, we got bass, low mids, high mids, top, and then air right on the end there. And in addition to being able to control the levels of all of these chains using what I've called the beef dials here, so yeah, ramp them up to increase the level of each of these chains. We've got a few extra macros here. Firstly, for the subsection, we've got dual sub on and off, which just turns this duplicated sub layer on and off. And we've also got a crazy dial, which for the top 3 sections has an on-off effect. For the lower ones, it actually has an effect which increases across the whole range. So slightly different action there. But essentially, what these do is just give that section an extra push, normally by controlling the bass and also sometimes the depth parameters of their saturation. And yeah, these effects may or may not be desirable. It kind of depends on what you're trying to do, particularly with the sub layer. Turning crazy sub on pushes it so hard that it becomes very distorted. Which probably wouldn't be something you'd want in most instances, but I thought I'd include it anyway. For the other sections, you might find it's a more useful effect. As it just gives them that real extra kind of saturation and quite often flattening out as well. So in addition to those macros, you've got a ton of snapshots here that I've made where you can instantly reset the effect. If I just unsolo it. Add just a bit of sub. Or actually a fair bit of sub. Distorted sub. Chunky bass, bass and top. What I've called pushed, where you're really kind of pushing the saturators on most sections quite hard. and then what I've named Subless Wonder. So a really useful rack, I think, for helping you process bass sounds in particular and really target those bass frequencies and beef them up as much as you want. But also a ton of other sounds as well. This kind of rack could be really useful for everything from leads to maybe even vocals in some instances, but drums, certainly a ton of different synth sounds. So yeah, added bonus at the end of this tutorial. If you want to create your own snapshot, by the way, then it's easy to do. You just click New here, set up the rack how you want. And then when you're happy with your settings, click on the snapshot switch to update it, and then right click and rename it My Snapshot. And then, yeah, every time you want to load up those settings, you just click on the play there. So I hope you found this useful. And if you want to download this rack, of course, go to the download section of the community site and you'll see a link with the same image as this particular tutorial. So enjoy. And if you're watching this before Thursday, the 26th of Jan 2023, then make sure you tune in to Paul Maddox's live stream. Yep, he's back to share techniques with the Produce Tech community, and they're going to be on a similar kind of theme. So a continuation of this, looking at bass processing of some kind, and in particular how it relates to his genres, which are mostly house and techno, although I'm sure you could apply the techniques to other genres too. So definitely one to watch, and I'll see you all then.